Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in the PRIO Annual Peace Address series, inaugurated in 2010, we invite speakers from all over the globe, from a range of backgrounds and fields, academia, journalism, politics, activism, speakers who have insights to share relevant to the mission and agenda of the institution that I currently direct, the Peace Research Institute Oslo, PRIO. My name is Henrik Urdal, and I wish you all a warm welcome to this year's Peace Address. PRIO will celebrate its 60th anniversary next year. Since our inception, we have stood for a close connection between academia and practice. The cornerstone has always been excellent and innovative academic research, yet always with emphasis on utility and relevance to policy and practice, what we refer to as engaged excellence. The distinguished speakers we invite to give our annual addresses are all, in their own ways and from different perspectives, knowledgeable of matters relevant to peace and conflict. They are here to enlighten us, inspire us, challenge us to further our mission of working towards a world in which all conflicts are resolved peacefully. This year, we are honored to have Professor Deborati Guha Sapir as our keynote speaker. Debbie is director of the Center for Research on the Epidemiology of Disasters and a professor of public health at the University of Louvain, Belgium. She holds a PhD in epidemiology. Epidemiology, one thinks immediately of epidemics, virus, bacteria. How does this relate to peace research? Beyond the fact that we also know that disease mortality increases during armed conflict. Defined by the WHO, epidemiology is the study of the distribution and determinants of health-related states or events, including disease, and the application of this study to control of diseases and other health problems. In short, epidemiologists concern themselves with all factors that determine public health, factors that impact mortality directly, with measuring mortality, and not least how to control and prevent mortality. Therein and therefore, the science and politics of death tolls, as the title for this event goes, be that related to disease or disaster, hunger or war. This is what Professor Guha Sapir is invited here to reflect upon. Before she enters the podium, Hedda Beate Diankino Bakker, accompanied by Bernhard Greter, will give us a musical interlude. They will perform Visi di Arte from Giacomo Puccini's Tosca. Thank you to our fabulous musicians, Hedda and Bernhard, for setting the stage with such beautiful tones. And now, today's headliner, and I very much look forward to hearing what Professor Guha Sapir has to tell us, and after her talk, invite Morten Rostrup up here with me and Debbie for a discussion between the three of us. Professor Guha Sapir, Debbie, hails from Kolkata, India, and is, as already mentioned, the director of the Center for Research on the Epidemiology of Disasters, or CRED among friends, based at the Université Catholique de Louvain in Belgium. She earned her PhD in Epidemiology and Preventive Medicine from the same university. She is a member of the Lancet Commission on Syria and won the 2009 Peter Safar Award for services to pre-hospital and disaster medicine. Her research interests and expertise span the areas of climate security, social determinants of health, civil conflict and natural disasters, and civil mortality and health, child mortality and health. Debbie, we look very much forward to listening to you. The floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is of course an honor for me to be here. This honor was particularly strengthened when I looked at the list of the preceding speakers for the Papa lecture, which made me not a little nervous. And therefore, I have been working on what I should address this audience in the context of the longer tradition of the Papa lectures. More than an honor, it is a pleasure for me to be here because PRIO and CRED has had a long history of collaboration. This is an unusual collaboration because we have found between the two groups a very rich meeting ground of political scientists, social scientists, and epidemiologists. This is a bridge which is a hard bridge to build because very often the terminology, the understanding of concepts do not actually match. But in this particular case, we have a long history. I see many faces here with whom I go back too many years. I don't want to put a date on it. It will, be not so flattering for my stage of life, but this is a pleasure indeed. So, beginning with that, I will start with the science and politics of death tolls, hunger, disasters, and war. Now, as Hendrik mentioned, we have been working for the last maybe 10 or 15 years on mortality. Mortality in civil conflicts and mortality in natural disasters. And this has been not an easy ride. It's been a bumpy ride. It started very smoothly in the beginning. We started with natural disaster mortality. That is our legacy, if you like. For 30 years, we've been working on natural disasters. And then we moved into civil conflicts. And in civil conflicts, we moved from studying nutritional stress, morbidity, levels of mobility, prevalence of disease, to people dying. How many people are dead? And that started with Darfur. And I will bring you through the path a little bit, but first I will give you two just contextual slides. One is how did epidemiologists get into what would be a broader problematic, which is definitely more linked to political science and social sciences. And this goes back to 1970, and it shows how old I am, but I wasn't there at that time. I must say I was still a student. But it goes back to 3 medical epidemiologists, one of whom was my boss, Michel Le Chat. He was a very, very well-known leprologist, began with infectious diseases. He, John Seaman, who was the head of Save the Children, Radha Banen, I think, in the Nordic countries, medical director, and Claude de Vildegoye, who some of you may know. He was also the head of the medical director in WHO in the Latin America, in the Americas. They started a center, which then became CRED, where they put forward the idea that the problem of a disaster can be actually studied using epidemiological techniques, epidemiological methods. And the way they did it is that they fitted the disaster into the epidemiological model, a little bit like the way I have put it on this slide. So there's an exposure to an event. In that case, the exposure could be an earthquake. There's an acute event. You're exposed to the earthquake. You may be susceptible to death due to this earthquake. And then you have those who are not dead, although exposed. So in other words, if you have equal exposure to an earthquake, equal exposure, that you're all in the same area where the earthquake occurred, some people have a higher risk of dying than others. And the question that epidemiologists would look at is what makes some people with equal exposure more at a risk of death than the others. And so the three epidemiologists studied first a very famous classic study in epidemiology for the earthquake in Campania in southern Italy, in Naples, in 1980. Take no credit for it, I wasn't even there. It got published, and it was the cornerstone of disaster epidemiology, because they then found out that, in fact, when you have a set of people exposed to the same event, in this case the earthquake, those individuals who actually live alone, very often students, so in other words, normally a low-risk mortality group, 23 to 25-year-olds, you would say, or even, no, sorry, not 23, 25 to 30-year-olds, 25 to 35-year-olds, so young male adults who are the lowest mortality risk. They were shown to be having the highest mortality risk in an earthquake because very often they were students and they were living alone. And they found that, in fact, living alone is a very high risk factor in earthquakes because most of the time, if you survive an earthquake alive, that is, you're dug out alive, you're dug out by your family or your flatmates or people who live with you. Once you realize that, intuitively it seems to make sense. By the time external help comes, most of the people are dead. The highest rates of mortality is within the first 6 hours of an earthquake. So if there are no local people to help you to get out, you're not going to survive. So they found that living alone is a very high risk factor. They also found that older children, in public health, what do we learn? The highest vulnerability to death is for women and children in an acute disaster. Well, in this case, it's not women and small children. It's not women and 0 to 5-year-olds. It's children who are between 5 and 9. They are at a higher risk of mortality. And why is that? Because in an acute event, a chaotic acute event, very small children tend to be protected by their parents. The parents will carry them and take them outside. Whereas 5 to 9-year-olds are often asked to run, essentially. And they are not old enough to get their act together and run. So you had a higher mortality risk at children before 5 to 9. And these are, it might seem like a lot of detail, but in fact, it has very important policy implications. If it's 5 to 9, who are at higher risk of mortality for earthquakes, what does it mean? It means that education has to be provided in schools, in primary schools. That is where you're going to have a much better impact on survival if you teach young children what to do when there's an earthquake. The Japanese have learned that. I also want to point out that most of my slides here and most of the numbers that I will show you are drawn, not all, but most of them are drawn from two databases that are run by CRED. One is the MDAT database, which is a natural disaster database, which collects data on every natural disaster event from 1900, so the beginning of last century, to today. We have a daily a system of daily reporting, which we pick up, and then we enter it into the database, and this is available to the public on the website. It covers 184 countries, and it covers all natural disasters. The second one is the Complex Emergency Database of Health and Nutrition Indicators, and that is a database that is a repository of surveys that are done in conflict-affected communities. Now, what happens is that a lot of the NGOs, humanitarian NGOs, do surveys. It's a relatively recent phenomenon. They do surveys, small surveys, all the time for nutrition and mortality. And these surveys, actually, nobody really uses them except the NGO themselves, and even that. For some reason, there's been the donors who've been making a lot of pressure on the NGOs to collect data on conflict-affected communities. But it doesn't look as though either the donors or the NGOs actually use it. We can discuss that later on, but be that as it may, over the last 8 or 9 years, we have been collecting all the surveys, and we've been validating them, and it is available. Well, it's not available actually, and it's put in a database called CDAT, and we will see some of the data from there. So, mortality and malnutrition in crisis. The whole issue of death tolls has become a huge issue in the last few years, maybe over a decade. It's become a very important. Everyone says, how many people dead? No, there's not more people dead. No, there are less people dead. You're counting it wrong, so on and so forth. So there's been a lot of back and forth, and the whole thing has sort of taken on a very high profile in the discourse of the humanitarian community. How many people are dead? Why are we so concerned with how many people are dead? Because you can actually argue that it's a very late indicator, as we would say in epidemiology. It's a late indicator. That is, when people are dead, they are dead. You really, in a sense, don't have to worry about them anymore. That's the truth. The people who are giving the aid are worried about the people who are living. And the people who are dead, you have to take care of the families and so on and so forth. But essentially, you have to deal with the people who are living. So it's a late indicator. So you should be looking at what we call leading indicators, indicators that tell you what's happening, what's going to happen in the next few months, what's going to happen in the next 9 months, not late indicators like mortality. But in fact, deaths have taken a huge amount of oxygen in this data collection, humanitarian data collection issue. And people have been drawn into it, including us. So why would we collect data on mortality? We collect data on mortality from one instance for advocacy and fundraising. We look at very specific examples of what that is. And these points are, in fact, some of them support each other and some of them actually go against each other. And we'll look at it in a little more detail and maybe in the discussion. Second is data is collected on deaths for prosecution, for the International Criminal Court. We serve as expert witnesses to the ICC in The Hague because they need to have specific data on deaths from a particular conflict if they want to bring a case against whoever they think is the perpetrator of this. Third is the UN Emergency Declaration. Now that sort of very special thing has happened, and it's quite revealing. What has happened in the last, I don't know when, maybe when Sphere started 10 years, 15 years ago. What we have done is we have put, and rightly so, we have put emergency thresholds, right? So we have said that humanitarian aid will be given when mortality reaches, under 5, child mortality reaches 2 per 10,000 per day. So that is the standard, that is the norm. And 2 per 10,000 per day, that is the threshold. After that, it's an emergency. And therefore, you have the right to release emergency funds or whatever it is that the country is going to be able to give. 10% for malnutrition, it's 10% global acute malnutrition. So if you have 10% global acute malnutrition, it will release humanitarian funds. But quantitative thresholds mean quantitative data. That's what it means. So once you put these quantitative thresholds, we are committing ourselves to having quantitative data. Because if you don't have quantitative data with the quantitative thresholds, the first one is meaningless. You can't do anything with it. And lastly, improving effectiveness of humanitarian aid. For me, this is probably the most important reason for collecting data. Improving effectiveness of humanitarian aid for priority setting and targeting. And we'll look at these one by one. Advocacy. So, advocacy. How many died in the Darfur genocide? Now, the Darfur genocide was a textbook case. Because before the Darfur genocide, for whatever reason, Bush was in power then. I don't know whether that's the right word to use, but Bush was the president of the United States. And the Darfur genocide had started this whole, it was the first real example of numbers about the people being dead, thrown out into the public. And here you have on this slide the different kinds of figures that was being batted around in the press. 50,000 dead, 150,000 dead, 400,000 dead, God knows. I mean, there's all kinds of, I've only chosen some. So the press was having a field day, this one dead, this one said that one dead, and so on and so forth. And there was a whole story about how many people are really dead. And is it a genocide? This was a case in which we were called to the International Criminal Court for witness, because they were trying to bring Omar al-Bashir to the ICC. They were trying to prosecute Omar al-Bashir. They didn't at the end. They prosecuted one of his ministers. But what we learned at that time was something which is not directly related to this, but something which I found extremely revealing for me. I hadn't thought of it. That genocide actually does not first need to have even one person dead. You know that, yes. I didn't know that. I mean, genocide for me was Cambodia, was the Holocaust, was all these, hundreds and thousands of people being massacred. Eh bien, no. It doesn't need to have even one person dead. You have to prove in a court of law that there was an intention of removing a whole ethnic or religious group of people. There was the intention. So even if there was not even one people dead. So all this discussion about Darfur was in fact not relevant. Second is genocide. Accusation of genocide actually can be brought against an individual or more than one individual, not against an event. So that's also what we learned, is because we were looking at it from a public health point of view, from a group. And the special prosecutor, Andrew Cayley, who was a British guy, very good guy, he came actually personally to all our meetings in The Hague. And he explained that they cannot bring an accusation of genocide against an event. They have to bring it against an individual, which meant that he wanted to know from us that could we say with any certitude that these many people who were killed, that we estimate having been killed in West Darfur, were actually linked to a particular minister or a particular individual, which we couldn't, of course. So, our testimony was not court-worthy. Those two things I learned. Now, this really changed the way we looked at the problem of mortality. And our work on Darfur at that time came into a righteous clash against, funnily enough, against several liberal thinking American groups, very well-known American groups, very active American groups, groups of individuals and researchers with whom we would have aligned ourselves 150%. Friends of ours. So what happened to us is that we made some calculations. You can look up the paper. We made some calculations, and then we faced this movement in the United States who were trying to stop Bush's support of Omar al-Bashir and have America to put pressure on Omar al-Bashir to stop the attacks in Darfur. So we were between a rock and a hard place, and it actually ended up with us having a lot of irate backlash from these American universities and these American researchers who we respect and admire, who essentially said, sorry, which side are you on? Because our estimates of people, the numbers of people who died in Darfur, were way lower than the estimates made by the American groups, way lower. So as a result of that, that is where science and politics came to a head. Because on one hand, we had this incredibly obtuse, highly statistical calculations published in the Lancet about how many people died in Darfur, and that number was actually much smaller than the advocacy people in the US who were fighting a battle to get the Americans to put pressure on Omar al-Bashir. And that was the first time we saw how mortality figures, in fact, have a very strong political component. So whether you're saying 500,000 dead or whether you're saying 150,000 dead makes a big difference on how much pressure you can put on the politics. So, since then, this whole confrontation, not conflict, God knows we see enough conflicts, this confrontation between the mortality, numbers of people dead, more, less, so on and so forth, how good are your methods, sort of proliferated. And then we came to Iraq, which was also a big affair. Iraq published, the Lancet published in September, just before the midterms. At that time, 2006, I think, 2006, just before the midterms, like now. Just before the midterms, September, Lancet published this paper on Iraq, which was a cluster sample study done by Johns Hopkins for the whole country, and it essentially came out with a conclusion that 660,000 people have died, excess people have died in Iraq because of the war, in which, of course, the Americans were deeply engaged. I mean, the Americans were actually surplus on site and so on and so forth, as you see, killing civilians and so on and so forth. So 660. This immediately engendered a huge fight in the community of epidemiology and political science and so on and so forth, which essentially said, if you have 660,000 people excess deaths, you're going to have bodies piling up on the roads and things. This can't be possible, and so on and so forth. And there were 2 or 3 more surveys that were done. One was done actually in close collaboration with a Norwegian institute. And they came with estimates which were a lot lower. This controversy has not yet been resolved. It sort of goes on simmering a little bit. The most recent one is a very well-known one of the Puerto Rico hurricane. Now, slowly, this whole thing has shifted from civil conflict, which is a highly politicized incident in setting, to natural disasters, which so far were natural disasters. Okay, earthquake, Indonesia earthquake, 3,000 people dead. Well, what can you do? It happens. Natural disasters were protected from all of this. There was no controversy ever in number of people died. Well, slowly, thanks to Mr. Trump, we have now, with the hurricane, although it has happened already before him, we can't put all the blame on him, Hurricane Maria, Puerto Rico, came out after the next week, the week of the hurricane, he came out and said 67 people dead or 65 people dead, I don't know, some insignificant number, and went away essentially saying, look how wonderful we are, look how wonderfully we've responded, and look at Hurricane Katrina, and there were several thousand people dead. Went away, and then came a Harvard group, and then now a George Washington group who did a much more extensive research on it and said that, in fact, it's between 3,000 and 4,000 people who have died. And essentially what it means is that these numbers, 65 and 3,000, 4,000, are essentially condemnations of the state's ability to respond. That is what it is. When you say 3,000 or 4,000 people died in Puerto Rico, which is a rich place, this is a state of the United States, this is not Central African Republic. So when you have a hurricane there and 3,000 to 4,000 people die, then the implication is that the state is somewhere at fault. That is the implication. And that is why the death tolls have become so important and advocacy has become so important. So next point for me was prosecution. Prosecution and human rights abuses and so on and so forth. This particular purpose for death toll collection has a very important role to play because it does change public opinion, and politicians lean on it for many reasons. If the tribunals, like the former Yugoslavia tribunals, or if any of the tribunals actually use the data, they use usually data that is demographic data based on body counts. We'll go into that later on. It's not the kind of data that we collect. So here in this particular case, we have the Syrian war. And we've been doing some work with a very, very good data set on the number of people who have died in Syria due to war weapon deaths, violent deaths, war weapon deaths. And our results actually show that most of the deaths due to aerial bombing occur in children and women. The numbers are quite alarming. Really, the numbers are quite alarming. If you look at the arrows, and you can probably read it better than I can because the print is so small here that I cannot even read what I'm saying, but about 70%, the two arrows in the first column, second column, the two arrows jointly make up about 70% of the deaths among women, which are from essentially aerial bombing and aerial shelling. So in other words, and the second one is for children. I think it's for adult male children or something, I can't remember, can't see. So what is the message it sends for advocacy here? And that is what we have been trying to push without spectacular success, I must say, but we still hope. What does it say? It says essentially if there is aerial bombing in any one of these civil conflicts, whoever does it, whoever is the perpetrator, essentially children have a 5 times higher risk of dying. That is the reality. And what we would like to be able to say by all this sort of obtuse kind of statistical analysis and epidemiology and this and that and very boring stuff is that if we bomb civil targets or urban targets, children, your target essentially is our children. This is what it means. To put it very plainly, this is what it means. And while we cannot stop it, we can't stop it, we're nowhere close to the right forum, what we can do is that if we bomb, we must be aware of what the consequences are. That's it. And we have to sleep with it at night. We have to sleep with it at night. 5 times more risk of children being killed by bombs. So whenever people say, oh, this is surgical, whatever, surgical what? Surgical attacks or surgical something. This is not true. The data does not show this to be true. Oh, the arrows came later. That's good. So in Syria still, it is not just the share. The previous slide showed you the share of how many people died, how many women died, and of which how many died of aerial bombing and aerial shelling. But if we look at You're not seeing anything, are you? The screen is blank. Okay. So if we look at a time trend of deaths due to shelling, I think only it is, I can't remember. You see the curve, the red line is for children, and the blue line is for women. And you see over time, children have a increasing share of deaths. So as time goes on in the Syrian war, more and more children are actually dying. From 10% in the beginning of the war to nearly 25% towards the end. Next, we come to the UN emergency declarations. So, I told you earlier that we make thresholds. So when you have a humanitarian aid that has to be given to a country, the idea is that it has to meet a certain threshold. 2 children dead for every 10,000 per day. 10% of global acute malnutrition. If you come to those thresholds, then the humanitarian aid opens up. So, then we look at Ethiopia. Data from 2010 to 2015, many of these surveys, the little orange dots are from the CDAT database. The blue line that goes across are the UN, sorry, not the UN, but the big national surveys or the national statistics. And I think there is a red line which I can't see here. Yes, the red line is the emergency threshold. So what you see here, and there's a point that I would like to make about this, what you see here is that there are very few of the surveys, but nonetheless there are surveys which show a very, very high rate of child mortality, very high, in certain specific areas. In this particular case, it's Afar and Gambela. So those of you who know Ethiopia, then there must be several over here. Afar Gambela is along the border of Sudan, and Afar is up north, the border of Eritrea, I hope. Similarly, in Sudan, you have, most of them are below the threshold, but there are certain specific areas that are above the threshold. And that is an important point. Where are those places? What can we do with information like that? What can we do when we know that only some of them are above the threshold? Similarly, for global acute malnutrition, we see that most of the surveys are below the threshold, and then there are 4 surveys in Afar district up in the north with very, very, very high rates of global acute malnutrition, but only in Afar. This has an implication for aid, for targeting aid. Small differences make big decisions, and this is also an important aspect. If we calculate for these thresholds, if we calculate correctly, which is a very complicated calculation, and we can discuss after that whether it's worth making this complicated calculation. If we calculate correctly, then we would get one result. And if we calculate a little bit, like that, then we will get a different result. And that can make or break the threshold. Right. So as you see in the second graph that I put up there, you will see the first calculation gives you a 0.98 value, which is below the 1 over 10,000 a day. Now I'm trying to think why should, I think crude mortality, sorry. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So 0.98 for the first, and the next one is 1.02. Whichever one you come out with is going to either trigger or not trigger a humanitarian response. And as you see in the first graph, that it's a sort of a messy way of calculating. The last one is improved effectiveness of aid. Now, of all the reasons I've given before, advocacy is for people who are trying to make a change, activists. They don't need to have precise data. They have rough data, it's good enough. It's really good enough. This is what I think. I mean, maybe, we can discuss this later on. But most of the others, and the International Criminal Court guys, in any case, the tribunals will go through and dig up every single body and put together with forensic anthropologists, how many bodies there were and things. But improving effectiveness of aid, I think that is probably the most important reason for collecting this data. The first graph shows you the difference between national statistics and statistics collected by NGOs with small surveys. And you will see, I will not go through, not on mainly because I can't even read it myself, but you will see that the national statistics on malnutrition or mortality do not correspond, in most cases, with the statistics collected by small-scale surveys. Very different, very different. Remember that national statistics, or even the UN statistics, which come from the national statistics, usually completely exclude conflict-affected zones, right? So they don't go there. They will even tell you in small print. The DHS will tell you that we were not able to go to this and this county or district because there was insecurity. So in other words, you're really getting, the data that you're getting is from the good sides, from the good communities. The really bad ones don't even get in there. The second map actually shows you what small-scale surveys can tell you. It gives you a very, very refined idea of where the problem is, And so, in other words, with a reducing resources per capita, the total resources, I think, is not reducing, but reducing resources of humanitarian aid per capita, it is 100 times more important to target, to go to the place where there is the problem and handle that, and not have a kind of a bazooka-like approach to it, and let's take the whole country. Yemen is an interesting case in point. Very little data, very much pressure to have something out from there. And what is quite interesting, which I sort of found out, we are doing quite a lot of work on Yemen right now. It's a bit of a struggle. But essentially, measles mortality. Mortality due to measles is the highest, surprise, surprise, in the areas which have the highest rates of air raids. So these are very, very high numbers of air raids in these 4 areas. This is Sada, where there is the Saudi border. So the Saudis don't want masses of Yemenis coming into their country, so they're bombing the living daylights out of there. Sana'a is a Houthi stronghold. Hodeidah now is the port, has been the most recent target, and Taiz is the control of the canal. So those are the 4 places, and those are the 4 places where measles mortality is the highest. So I will just leave you with a few thoughts. One of the big dilemmas that are going on now is whether or not when politicians say, oh, there's a big crisis, or there's this famine, or there's this and that, I don't know what. How reliable is this kind of thing? Should we act right away? Should we immediately pump money into these places? And if we don't, will the humanitarian community be at fault? Are we late? 2011 famines in the Horn of Africa, we didn't act in time, and sort of guilt eats us up. We didn't do anything. So we require data, but from where and how? What are the mind-numbing statistical details to make it credible? We leave the mind-numbing statistical details aside because I don't want to numb your mind right now. But essentially the questions are as follows. What kind of data do we look for mortality, for morbidity, and for nutrition? Big surveys or small surveys? There is a lot of discussion going on. Big surveys are the DHSs, the MICs, the UNICEF Multiple Indicator Cluster Surveys, big guys. It costs 1 million a pop, and you do it every 5 years, and then you sit with that data and you kind of mash it about and look at it. Those are the big surveys. And then there are the small surveys, which are these NGOs who are running around, all of them now using the same methodology. NGOs have come a long way, it has to be said. They've come a long way. Professional guys, most of them, very good recruitment. Small surveys, lots of these hundreds of little small surveys, they have their problems. The hardcore epidemiology statisticians, democrats will say, no, we can't do anything with these surveys, they're too patchy and things. But essentially, that's all we got, guys. Between the two DHS surveys every 5 years, the only thing we have are these small-scale surveys from the countries. That's all. The second area of battle is our methods. Because once you start having a number, how did this number come? Why are you saying it's 500,000? Nobody knows it's 500,000. What is the method? And the methods, essentially, there are 4 methods that are being batted around. One are these cluster samples. You take clusters from different parts of the country. That's what the Johns Hopkins people did in Iraq. That's what IRC, International Rescue Committee, did in Congo, and so on and so forth. Take clusters around, and you make an estimate for the whole country. That's one. Second are body counts. Body counts are very important. These are people who painstakingly count bodies. They are usually very, very minutious. Minutieux? Anyway, I don't know whether the word exists. Anyway, I just made it up. They count bodies, and then they come out with a number. And usually, if you have to count a body, your total number is going to be much smaller than anything else, any other estimate. So these are body counts, and those are the ones that only count for court, for prosecutions. Small surveys are the ones that I just told you about. These are tiny surveys, 300 or 400 sample surveys. And the last one, which is now, put out in the table for discussion, are Bayesian approaches for estimating. And Bayesian approaches are an interesting approach because they actually bring together quantitative methods with qualitative information. So Bayesians, what do these Bayesian guys do? They get information from experts, people who sometimes know much more than data. They are usually right. You talk to the experts, and from the experts, you get kernels of information, and you feed it into the model. And that is a mix of quantitative and qualitative work. Finally, what are the operational issues that actually need resolution right now? I know that my discussant comes straight from the field, Morten, and he has been working in the field for many years. I was careful about what I finish up with. So what are the operational issues needing resolution? First is, how do you get the best out of available data? Is the problem too little data? Or is it a lack of innovative techniques? And I would argue that it is actually the latter. I would argue, and probably I'm the sole voice in the wilderness on this, I think there is enough data out there. I really do. And I think to use humanitarian budgets and humanitarian monies to collect more data is really giving a gift to nerdy statisticians in universities. Really, I like nerdy statisticians. I depend on them for a living. So, I wish them best, and I wish them all the data they can get. But in this particular case, I really think that the data we already have should be used, exploited much more. That's my take on it. Second, faster turnover from data collection in the field to decision makers. DHS takes nearly a year before the DHS survey results are available to anybody. This cannot work in a humanitarian setting. Smaller surveys tend to have a 3-month return. So in 3 months you can get, and maybe we can even improve it. So you make small surveys and get the data out as fast as possible. Third, an international independent group to validate data and ensure credibility. The problem with data is that if it's a politician who puts out the data and without any much support for it, people are going to say, oh, he's a politician, I don't know what, he or she wants this thing done or that thing done, and there's a hidden axe to grind. And very often it's true. If it's NGOs who put this out, NGOs from the field who put out the numbers, people will say, oh, the NGOs, they want more money. So of course they're inflating the data. So it has to be done by an honest broker. And if there is no honest broker, the ball will be continuously shifted from one camp to the other, and everyone will be accusing everyone else of partisanship. Sorry, I forgot to give you the 3 operational issues. Finally, I would like to leave you with a development which I think is particularly disturbing, and it is disturbing to the point that I have faced some losses for it, having spoken out at the European Union level, which has not gone down very well. It's okay, I'm not a European Union person, so nobody cares. Looking further than drones, there is this very disturbing tendency to be going through a strange mindset in which we do not understand, actually, the main factors that bring peace, that is stability. How do you bring stability to people? And this stability is, in fact, providing individuals, providing communities on the ground with things they value. This is how the stability will bring about. If Europe does not want migrants on its shores, no amount of policing, walls, barriers, border patrols will stop them. We are talking of people whose lives are desperate, and they will find a way to go around the drones and the walls and the barriers and the police and the border patrols. They will. I would too. That is not an answer. The answer is investing, putting more money, even in the border areas, if not in Syria, then around Syria, to help people have some hope for the future. Provide education, provide help, provide nutrition. That will give them hope. And hope is the only thing that will stabilize a population. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very engaging and very inspiring talk, Debbie, and ending on such an important point as well. We will be hearing more from you very shortly, but before then we will have a small musical contribution. In the meantime, Hedda and Bernard will perform Io son l'umile ancella from the opera Adriana Le Couvreur by Francesco Cilea. Thank you once again to our two musicians, Hedda Beate Dicanio Bakker and Bernhard Greter, for a wonderful performance. Ladies and gentlemen, may I introduce to you Morten Rostrup, medical doctor by profession. Morten is co-founder of the Norwegian chapter of the MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders. This was 22 years ago. In 1996, the same year as Morten was climbing Mount Everest. I just learned a particularly productive year for Morten, if my intel is correct. Morten is now a senior physician at the Department of Acute Medicine, Oslo University Hospital, and also a professor at the University of Oslo. He's been one of those who move in when others flee conflict and disaster zones, working as a field MD on a number of MSF missions. He has also been a frequent voice in the debate on humanitarianism and aid, perhaps primarily in the Norwegian language, but as having served as president of the MSF International Council attests to, clearly he is no mute on the international scene either. I'm very happy to have you join us up here, Morten and Debbie. If you want to sit to the right, we'll have Debbie here on the left.
Would you want to sit here?
Please. And I would like to go straight to you, Morten, for some immediate comments to Debbie's talk.
Yeah. A lot of things flashed through my mind, actually, when you talked. It was a brilliant lecture. And one of the things I really saw that I've been in many of the places you mentioned. So I was back in Darfur. I was there in 2007. I remember the whole genocide discussion. Mm-hmm. It was very difficult. When I was there, we didn't have, this kind of high mortality. It was a very complex situation. A lot of militias, very much different groups there. But and then you went through, Syria, and been there, and Iraq, and so on. But I think your last point. There's a lot of things I think we can talk about. But your last point about hope, giving hope, I think that was very important. And this is what we see very clearly in the field in two ways. In January, I was in Bangladesh. I was working with the Rohingya refugees, forced out of Myanmar, almost 1 million now, living in a camp. And you could look at their faces, that it was apathic. They were depressed. They had a terrible past, many of them, and they had no future. There was no hope. And you could really see that. And I've been in refugee situations in Africa. I've seen quite another kind of mentality in the sense that, okay, this is very bad, this is terrible, but we have hope. There will be something coming. And they stick to that kind of belief. So I really liked it. I think it's very, very important. And what you said, that to have education, to have health and nutrition is a key to give hope. And what struck me then was that to destroy education, to bomb schools, to bomb bakeries, to bomb hospitals has been a strategy in the war. Because then you take away the hope for the people there. And you use it as a weapon of war, in a sense. It's a war crime. And when you go to Syria, you see what's going on. So you see the two parts of it. But I found it very interesting, what you were telling. And to me, I think data, they are important. Statistics are important. We use it in the field several times. We have small surveys in MSF. And I've been looking at those many times when we have been doing operations. But they have to be valid, as I said. They have to be reliable and correct calculations, for sure. And I think even more so today, when you have an increased mentality among people, a skepticism towards science, a skepticism towards experts. It's they call it a post-factual time now, and you have alternative facts, etc., etc. It's becoming difficult because it's so important to document what's going on, both for the operations we do, but also that people see the consequences of warfare. And when you show the increased child mortality in Syria is terrible, from 2011 up to 2016. It's terrible what's going on. And other places you can see the same. So it's very important. But then how to make this information out, as you said, to the decision makers, that's the key. How to make people grasp what's really going on. And this is my last point before we have this discussion, but there's so much interesting aspects of this from your very nice lecture. And that's, we as human beings, and if I read about Yemen today, and we can discuss a bit about Yemen, UN says maybe 14 million people are at stake now, maybe a famine, imminent famine, they talk in that kind of language, we can discuss that. But can we grasp that? Can we as human beings do that? Or 350,000 deaths in Syria? That's the problem with numbers and human psychology. And when you have a little child on a beach in Turkey during the refugee crisis, 3-4 years old, dead on the beach, we all get terribly engaged. And we see the human face of all in the statistics. And this is, it's interesting how difficult it is to really get people to understand what's behind those numbers. So they start acting. When Angela Merkel saw the dead boy on the beach, this is terrible. People started to look at that. And the war in Yemen has been going on since 2015. And we knew about a terrible situation. All the politicians knew about it. And then there is a journalist being killed in Turkey, linked to criticizing the regime that have the warfare, or main part of the warfare. Then a human tragedy is put in place, and there is sudden an interest to the whole political game going on, and the military game. Because now it's something people can... This is horrible. A journalist may be tortured and killed. This is terrible. And this is a regime that is part of a war that may have killed 10,000 already. But then the politicians didn't react. But yesterday, the foreign minister in the United States, the foreign minister in the UK, they say that we have to stop this war. No, ceasefire. It was initiated due to the killing of one. And this tells how difficult all this is with our human psychology. I think I'll leave it there, just some kind of reflection on how you have these important numbers and get them out and get people to understand it, and then how to move forward, because it's so important work you're doing. And I've seen this service in the field, and I've been there, so I know that.
Thank you very much, Martin. I think we'll return to many of these issues during the discussion. I wanted to put out, sort of as a starter, a bit of a challenge, I guess, to both of you. You mentioned, Debbie, initially the work that you've been doing on both Darfur and Iraq, coming up with numbers that are, considerably lower than some of the most heightened, politicized numbers. We have the situation with Yemen now, with the UN Emergency Relief Coordinator Mark-Andrew Lowcock recently coming out and saying that half the population in Yemen is at a high risk of dying from hunger, and MSF the next day coming out saying that this is actually not the case. We have to stop exaggerating the situation. Why should we be concerned about numbers being incorrect and being inflated? Humanitarian organizations are working in the field. They're doing their very best, fighting an enormous global veil of ignorance. They are trying to draw attention to humanitarian catastrophes that are neglected. Major human suffering, whether it's 2 million, 3 million, 4 million people, and many of these are forgotten conflicts that humanitarian organizations are trying to draw attention to. So why should we, as researchers, come and say, we don't have the data, we don't have the proper methods, we're not sure if the situation is as bad as it is. What is the danger of inflating numbers? Why do we need to continue to make this effort, which sometimes then is putting us at risk of colliding with our good colleagues, liberal colleagues in the US, who are working with the best intentions. You want to go ahead?
Okay, sure. Let me kick this off. Now, first of all, I didn't realize that, in fact, they said first 50% were at high risk of dying and then walked back, saying that...
The MSF did. The MSF said that there really isn't this kind of data available that would support such a claim, that we're not facing that level of acute undernutrition.
Yes, I think and what this reveals actually is a international development policy gap. And what is the international development policy gap? Development and humanitarian policy gap. Yemen has been a poor country for many years. A very poor country, not perhaps in relation to the really poor countries in some of the sub-Saharan Africas, but it's still been a poor country. Now, when there is the data that comes out of Yemen and the levels of malnutrition, and if you compare that today, and if you compare that to what it was in Yemen 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, the difference is not huge. In other words, Yemen has been living through really bad nutritional situation for now many years. It's just that now people have started getting interested in Yemen, for whatever reason. And then you come out with some numbers which look really bad, but if you look at it in the past, it has been pretty much this bad for many years. Now, what does that mean? It means that our development policies have been at fault, not our humanitarian policies. Our development policies. If you have very high malnutrition rates in a country for the last 15 years, this is not a humanitarian issue. This is a development issue. And I think there is an important space here to really bring the development institutions into this thing, saying, the World Bank, the World Health Organization, the UNICEF, or whatever, whoever, UNDP, all of these guys, I think it is important to make them responsible, to say that Yemen has been teetering on the edge for 15 years, not the last 3 years. And I think that is what is the crux of the Yemen problem. Some countries are doing quite well, and then they have a crisis and they get really bad. But some not. Yemen has been like this for years and years and years. And so MSF is right in the sense that the situation is not quite as bad in terms of a humanitarian crisis. This is a problem that has been there for many, many years. What we do with that is another issue.
I think why it is important, of course, not to inflate the numbers is because we need to trust statistics. We need to trust the information we get from the field, from these surveys. If we start to inflate numbers for political reasons or whatsoever, then people will lose totally trust in them. And when there really is a reason to ring the alarm bell, then nobody may not listen anymore. And we have had several incidents like this before. And I remember back in 2002, there was the end of the civil war in Angola. UNITA had been fighting the government forces for quite many years. They had certain part of the territory was controlled by the UNITA. And at the same time, the UN was talking about an beginning famine or hunger situation in East Africa. We didn't see in the field any signs of any famine in East Africa. maybe there was some food insecurity, some places, okay, but something we could deal with. But in Angola, when we got access to these areas controlled by the UNITA, we had more or less a famine. Famine defined not only malnourished children, but also adults. And this is a key. We try to ring the alarm bell to the UN and say that, okay, East Africa, here is the problem in Angola. And they did not intervene properly. They said later they didn't have resources, etc., but there were also political reasons. I know that. We did a survey, we did an analysis of the situation. We even went to the headquarters of the UN, and I had, because I was the president of the time, had a meeting with Kofi Annan, and telling him directly, you know, see what's going on. And there are other incidents as well. There was, you said, the famine on the Horn of Africa in 2011 also did not turn out to be that bad as the alarm bells. But then, again, okay, UN 2 days ago said that there's an imminent danger of famine in Yemen. 14 million people may die from starvation. That's what they said. We think MSF people have been there in the field. They don't recognize this. And one major point is that there is no access to the major part of Yemen. Yeah. To really conclude like that, you need a global assessment. You're an expert on this. And you don't have that. You have some areas, but there are vast areas you don't know what is going on. But still, they do this. And then I started to think today. I saw MSF with asking questions, you know, this is not really correct. But by doing this, they seem to have moved a political response to have a ceasefire. So to put it very, very blunt, by lying a bit about the numbers, maybe you can push the politicians and you can create a ceasefire. Then your question is good. Is it wrong to do it if you now get a ceasefire? What's the ethics in this? I just asked the question because we always want to be honest and trustful to data we present. And next time maybe they will not listen anymore. I don't know.
And these discussions are, how do these discussions look from the inside of an organization like MSF? I mean, you're known for being very cautious. That's one of the strengths that when something is coming from the MSF, it has a very high degree of reliability. But is it also possible that you may sometimes become too cautious? I mean, Debbie says that we have too, in a sense, too much data sometimes. At the same time, we know that there are areas that are severely undercovered, both with national surveys and with specific surveys. So, is it if we don't really know, can we afford to say that we can't say that there is a disaster because we don't have the data?
Well, we can say there may be a disaster even though we don't have any data. And I remember when I was in Bahr el Ghazal in '98, there was a famine in Bahr el Ghazal in South Sudan. It was terrible. It was really terrible. People were dying. There were skeletons, adults, children. I've never seen anything like it. It was really terrible. You didn't know, you didn't need any statistics to see that this was really a famine, a terrible situation. And then you can ring all the alarm bells. It even took some time before MSF really did that, because people in the field, they may start, when they've been a long time in the field, they may start to think that this is a kind of normalcy. And this is, I think, a problem we face too much these days and the last years, is that we tend to see what is really tragic and terrible, that we look at that as a kind of normal situation because it's been going on for such a long time. So it's not news anymore. It's not any sensation about it. Even the warfare, different places, that bombing hospitals, okay, yeah, that's normal now in wars. So it keeps going on. But the alarm bell can be there. We did have a survey, terrible survey about the global nutrition situation and mortality in Najib, where I was. And we used that as well. And Ebola crisis. MSF saw that the Ebola had spread to Conakry in Guinea. For the first time in history, Ebola entered a big city. There was not that much death or whatsoever, but that was unprecedented. And then we ring the alarm bells and we tell, we have to act. And then the UN said that MSF is exaggerating. This is not as bad. Shut up, in a way, keep calm. It was very frustrating at the time, very frustrating. And then it became a full-blown epidemic, spreading. So, yeah, it's important to have these data, but you must have them in a timely fashion, as you said.
If I just jump into actually about the famine thing, it must be said from Bahr el Ghazal, from that 1998, right? I don't know when it was, I can't remember. But it was a very, very bad famine then. And the mid-1980s, there were the famines of sub-Saharan Africa. The early 1970s, there were the famines. So there were these big famines at that time. Big, 6, 7, 8 countries, people dying in the lines waiting for food, right? People actually, and the second lot of famines, I think the second lot, 1983, 1985, famines of sub-Saharan Africa, I remember that they were, at that time I had just come from the US to Europe, I remember, and they had the journalists, very famous journalist, father and son called Dimbleby, Jonathan Dimbleby, and I forget what the father was called, but anyway, so they brought it to the television screens. What I was saying is people standing in the lines for food with dead people on each side. And that shocked the world. Now, this brings me to what you said in the beginning. Pictures and the media play a very important role, bad and good. And at the end of the day, all these mind-numbing stuff that I showed you on the slides, I don't think that's really going to, make a huge push for action. It's the MSF pictures, it's the journalists' pictures that will make a huge push for action. What I would argue here is that should we always need to have this media, media coverage to take a decision on some terrible situation? Why are we in a situation internationally, the international humanitarian community, which has come such a long way in the last 20 years, such a long way, made huge progress on many, many fronts. Why is it that we are still sitting, waiting for a Dimbleby or a journalist or an MSF picture to push us into action? And I think that is something that is the only thing that's sitting there, which is a worrisome bit of morsel to swallow. Everything else has moved forward. We don't have famines like this anymore. We don't. But we are still needing that trigger. We need Khashoggi's death to make.
Yeah, and that brings back to what I said. This is about the psychology of our mind, actually. It's the way we can grasp what's going on. I remember in Syria where we had these enclaves, and people were really stuck, and there were no humanitarian aid, no food whatsoever. And there was a picture of this little child just the moments before it died, a terrible picture as well, which was all over, and showed what was going on. So that's important. But then people also say that, are they really representative? And I know journalists that have been traveling around, we need to see a starving child, because there is a famine going on here, isn't there? So they come to MSF or can come to other organizations. Can you show us some really, really malnourished children? And maybe you can find some, maybe from other diseases they catch. And then they have a bit of pictures of it. And I think this is not the way it should be at all. And sometimes everybody may exaggerate. I remember we had a statistic for Egypt in '98, and then that was the epicenter of the famine, more or less. But if you extrapolated those statistics to the Bahr el Ghazal, you would have 40,000 children, more or less, dying within a very short time period, which was not the case. But based on the survey
Yes.
and an extrapolation, you could even, in a kind of scientific way, push some numbers, which is totally not the right thing to do. But what I would come back to, the necessity and what you do in Syria about the evolution of warfare and how you can use statistics to show trends that cannot continue. You know, something must, and
Be done.
but how to get people to act, the politicians to act? That's we have a lot of data. How to move them?
Of course, and then there are the situations where these kind of numbers are sometimes making politicians act in ways that we do not want them to act. Specifically in the way that, and you were referring to this, of course, initially as well, Debbie, on the huge uncertainties, especially when conflicts are breaking out, when the politicization of numbers become a very important part of the dynamic of the war. If you look at I mean, this is also partly the wish or the impact of humanitarian interventions, of intervening militarily in situations in order to protect the civilian populations against mass atrocities. Of course, you know, recent legacy being the cases of Rwanda in '94 and Srebrenica in '95. And having the importance of the Rajak massacre in Kosovo as an important aspect running up to the NATO bombing in Yugoslavia, and of course with Libya, where you had a sort of early numbers coming out from sources that were very inconclusive, or rather very broad, where you had the government estimating roughly 300 people. The WHO we're talking about 2,000 people being killed before the NATO intervention, and you had the rebels saying that you know, we're talking about 6,500 to 8,000 people being killed, and then the sort of numbers going up to 25 and 30,000. So it's a huge it's a very broad scale, and you find the same in a lot of conflicts where there is huge uncertainties as to what the actual human toll of conflict are, and the way that this is used politically. Of course, in the case of Syria, we now have data from both from CRED and UCDP suggesting that, you know, it's maybe between a tenth and a fifth of the sort of most exaggerated numbers. And it's of course a huge problem when political decisions have to be made based on very uncertain and highly politicized numbers. And so the question is, you know, what kind of so we want to make sure that we are able to ring the bell when the situation requires it, at the same time as we need to be cautious about not exaggerating a situation when it might actually have considerable implications. And the question is, so if we have enough data, what is it that we need in order to equip us with tools that allow us to, as reliably as possible, assess the situation on the ground and provide some sort of quality research-based contributions into that kind of extremely important political decisions?
Well, today, I think, I mean, just to clarify something, did you say that it was, some groups said that it was 10 to 20% of the death tolls in Syria that was more closer to the real figure? That in fact the figure is that what you were saying?
Libya.
Libya,
Yeah.
Libya.
So the provisionary government, the rebel groups were referring to between 6,500 and 8,000 people killed before the NATO intervention, which we now know was vastly exaggerated.
Yes, it's quite often the case, you know. Numbers can be exaggerated. It's not unusual, and it does a great disservice, as Morten said. It does a great disservice to the reality that once you exaggerate a number, what happens is, you know, a month later, 2 months later, somebody shows very convincingly that in fact this number is rubbish, and that then cuts the legs off the whole movement to get attention to that problem, because then people say, oh, look, this is all rubbish, you know, and actually there's nothing going on there. There are things going on there. That happened to us for us in Darfur, when we estimated, I can't remember, the median was 200,000 people who were excess deaths, and these other guys, the other way, 500,000, 600,000. The thing is, 200,000 started looking like, oh, 200,000, let's not do anything. And what happens is that you have to sort of somehow bring the pendulum back to the middle, because 200,000 excess deaths is a lot of deaths in an area where there are not many people. So I think there is a problem there in terms of exaggeration. But to go to your last question, what is it that we can do? As far as I can see, I mean, this sounds like a very kind of a bread and butter kind of a solution, and, you know, not very too pragmatic and nothing philosophical. But the reality is that the NGOs today, the big humanitarian NGOs today, are producing and collecting fairly high quality data from areas that most other places people are not going. The UN is certainly not going there. You know, the UN, if you go with the UN to some place, they're going to keep you in a barbed wire thing and not let you put your foot outside, or, you know, not sneeze or anything. So they keep you there. The UN is not going. Nobody else is going. Only those humanitarian guys are going. And to me, they must be supported to gather as much data and share that data on a common platform. This is the thing. They have to share it on a common platform, and if you have it from a common platform, then you have estimates, which is not a one NGO estimate, it's not a two NGO estimate, it's not this one, it's not that one, it's a common estimate. And that will have a much bigger impact and much more strength in the international platform, because it's going to be 15 big humanitarian NGOs who are putting together the data and coming out with that. And that, to me, is the way forward, really.
I think it's a very, very good point, and I know that many NGOs and MSF for a very long time have been working together with epidemiologists, with Epicenter in Paris, as you know. So while we are working as doctors, nurses with the patients, there are other people coming in, and they do all the surveys. They use the different methodologies you mentioned, etc., and then we get data. And that's very important for another reason, because the humanitarian action as such is based on impartiality, which is to give aid according to needs. And then you need, as you mentioned, you know, you need to define the needs. You need to know exactly what we have to do, so to make the correct operational decisions. And we use surveys to do that, and also to monitor, as you mentioned, which is very important, the effectiveness of what we actually are doing. So it's quite a lot of other kind of work we do as well, not only treating patients, but we really want to grasp what's going on and give as effective aid as possible. The problem sometimes is, as you mentioned, politicization. It's coming out, all data can be used or abused whatsoever by politicians or whatsoever. Whatever you say, somebody will take it and maybe change or manipulate it. I remember one, since you mentioned Iraq, because I was there in 2003 during the bombing campaign of George Bush. I think there were 12,000 bombs during a 6 weeks period he had over Syria, and many in Baghdad. I was working in a hospital. But then, after that bombing campaign, and the Americans invaded and took the control, we could do assessments around in Iraq to see the humanitarian needs, whether any mass displacement of the population, any epidemics, any malnutrition whatsoever, you know, looking at it. We didn't find any. There was not a humanitarian disaster in Iraq just after the war. At the same time, there were plenty of NGOs, and there was, of course, a political sentiment that this war was terrible. United States and UK should never go to war in Iraq, and there was a lot of protest ahead of the war, as you remember. And there was a lot of, in a way, political engagement in this. And when I got out from Baghdad and we had a press conference in Brussels, I said that there was no humanitarian disaster at this point in Iraq. From all the places we've been, we couldn't see this. And then the first speech George W. Bush was having after mission accomplished. You remember that on the ship. And then he said, I was especially happy that Doctors Without Borders said that there was no humanitarian disaster after this war. And you can imagine what happened to me in MSF. What? Have you been saying this? That was the truth, but now it was taken by Bush to support his kind of warfare. So we had, just quickly on that, we had to turn this around. Okay, if Bush is referring to MSF in his first speech, we will have a press conference in Washington, D.C. with a whole press corps. We will have meetings with Pentagon and the Foreign Ministry and tell how the Americans totally fail their obligations as an occupying power in Iraq, which was the case and which was also part of my message. But that was not taken. But so, people can play around on this. Of course they do. And also statistics and also numbers become then so important that this war is not that bad, and or that people use numbers to politically try to attack the people they don't like. So we have to be careful, and then maybe also some people manipulate the numbers and interpretation of the numbers.
I don't think anything can be done about that. That will always stay with us.
Yeah.
Manipulation of numbers.
But at the same time, I think if you you touched upon this as well, Debbie, that some of these sources of discrepancies, of disagreements, are also found in the research community. There are, and I thought I mentioned two quite contentious cases that you're both familiar with. One was the when trying to estimate indirect deaths, especially, it's not pretending that this is simple. On the contrary, measuring indirect mortality is notoriously complicated. At the same time, the devil is often in the details in the way that we're doing this, and you mentioned the small differences becoming significant, and the small numbers making big differences. If you look at the case of the DRC, if you read Wikipedia, DRC is now presented as the most deadliest conflict since the end of the Second World War, with 5.4 million people killed. That's based on estimates from the IRC, the International Rescue Committee, and surveys that they did over the years during the conflict in the DRC. At the same time, Human Security Report and others have been criticizing the researchers behind the IRC numbers for not primarily for the way that the data is collected, but the way that they're analyzed. Because what is being claimed is that they compare the mortality levels that they find in their surveys during the conflict with mortality levels, pre-war mortality levels that they claim are too low. And also that the actual mortality levels during conflict in the surveys are higher than for instance, what the demographic health survey data shows. So in a way, it's the overestimation of mortality during the DRC conflict is what is leading to these extremely high numbers, 5.4 million people killed, and at least the Human Security Report comes up with a figure which is around 860,000, which again is an enormous number. But at the same time, yeah, it faints in comparison with 5.4 million. And then we have Iraq, which is the the other case with the Burnham et al. Study, where there have been, I mean, you've been looking into some of the potential sources of biases there, but there's also criticism about the sampling methods, for instance, used where they've been oversampling side streets to main streets, which means that households that are closer to areas that are likely to experience, for instance, bombs at markets. So there are these, very subtle, aspects of the way that research is done that can have huge implications. And the extension of that, and this goes back to the politicization again, that researchers also become part of this discussion and being taken, their positions are used politically, and sometimes they also act as political actors themselves. And one of the critics that came, against the Burnham et al. Study was that their position was also sort of partly, or the claim was that their position was partly motivated by their own criticism of U.S. engagement in Iraq. And then, research is becoming politicized in a way that I think is very unfortunate in a situation where we need more than ever very strong, very clear, independent research contributions informing such important policy decisions.
You could first take up DRC, the Congo. As you know, the Belgians have some of the best experts on the Congo for nefarious reasons, actually, but still, they do have some of the people who know Congo best, demographers in particular. And in my university, the demography department is very, very good. It's one of the top in the world. So what I got from them is quite interesting. There's 5.4 million of the IRC study. The IRC did a nationwide study of the people killed in Congo due to the recent, I can't remember the details, but from what I understand, it was an estimate of the numbers of people who were killed due to the recent civil war, however many years it was. And what the Belgian demographers argue is they were quite upset about it, and they wrote a very, very pertinent, I don't know what it was, a note or a newspaper thing or whatever, saying that what the IRC, the mistake that IRC has made, or the misinterpretation the IRC has done, is that they have somehow, I can't remember the details, but they have somehow compiled all the people who have died in the past 20 years or the past 15 years or past X number of years, and they have made their excess deaths, which takes on this accumulated burden of the deaths. And essentially, it absolves, and this is here where the politics comes in, it absolves the Mobutu era of having actually contributed to most of these deaths. So their argument was that Mobutu era was the main culprit of the deaths of this 5.4 million. Most of these deaths were actually due to the Mobutu era policies, Mobutu's governance, and that the recent conflict contributes a much smaller slice. And what this particular IRC study does is that it completely absolves Mobutu's contribution to the state. And that was their problem with the methodology, and and they felt very strongly about it, because in Belgium, as in the United States, there's also a strong faction of people who are fighting for Belgians to do reparations for the Mobutu, for supporting the Mobutu era. Belgians were not by any means the only people who supported Mobutu. There were a lot of other countries who supported Mobutu, but Belgians was one of them. So there is that fight going on, and the DRC estimates were seen as a deliberate way of reducing the guilt of Mobutu, or the responsibility of Mobutu in the deaths. That's one. For the Iraq was definitely in don't quote me on this, she says to a room full of people. But the Iraq paper in the Lancet, which had such a huge press fallout, was definitely a political piece. No ifs, ands, and buts. The methodology was faulty, the results were faulty, the tables were wrong. Literally the tables, the columns didn't add up, partly because it was pushed through really, I mean, you can go back and see the paper and you will see the columns don't add up. It was the easiest criticism we could make in any paper that we've ever criticized. And it was essentially, what was it? It was a paper that was pushed right through the pipeline of the Lancet to be out in time for the November midterms. This is what it was. It came out at the end of September or somewhere there. So it was a political, of which one of the authors was actually running for a political position. A good guy, you know, on the left, way out on the left, you know, liberal Democrat, all of those good things. But he was running for a political position. And so it was a political document. But actually, it backfired. It really did. It was a mistake. It was a mistake of the Lancet. It was a mistake of the authors to do something like that, to, you know, kind of bundle up something and push it out, because it was like a sitting turkey. You know, it was a turkey shoot. You just read the paper, and any undergraduate student would be able to say, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. So it was a political thing. It did backfire, and it was a wrong thing to have done.
But this illustrates the problem if you exaggerate numbers, if you make, in a way, false papers whatsoever, how to trust the other ones, how to trust the coming papers in the Lancet or wherever. You're becoming suspicious now because this happened then. Mostly some of these big journals, they withdraw or they try to correct afterwards. But then the damage often has been done. Yeah, it's very unhealthy for the scientific community and how we are trying to express the reality we face, because we need to agree to a certain extent what kind of reality we face in order to have the correct actions. There's one question concerning some of these new conflicts, and that's the mortality due to direct violence, the direct effect of the war. And then when I was in Syria, for instance, and in Libya, for that sake, it's a lot of people with chronic diseases that they don't get the follow-up. And many of those patients die as well. And that's the consequences of a broken down healthcare system. And that's not in the table you were showing about the shelling and guns and all that kind of stuff. No. And we don't really have. Do we have those data in a sufficient way? All these people with chronic diseases that die due to lack of treatment and follow-up?
No, that data we don't have, it's true. And the Syria work we have been doing has only war weapons. Yeah. You know, that's what people who actually die of executions and of gunfire and so on and so forth. All the people who die because they can't get, adequate emergency care even, so emergency care or, obstetric complications and so on and so forth, you get a different kind of a data. The data that we used for the Syria analysis, that was each death was counted. And we knew each weapon that killed that person. So this was very detailed very detailed mortality data. It was line data. You know the name, you had sometimes a picture of the cadaver, you had, very detailed data. For the kind of data that you're talking about, we don't have an option other than making estimates of excess deaths. You take a baseline, you say, this is how many people we expect to have died in this month, and instead we find so many people have died, so everybody who's in this, the difference between what we expect and what we observe are people who have died due to the war. That is the best we can do at this time, yeah.
I feel extremely privileged to have the opportunity to sit here and discuss these matters with you that also are very near to my heart. We are nearing the end of this session. Unfortunately, there are a number of issues that I know we could continue to discuss inevitably, including both the way that mortality estimates or battle counts are used to prosecute crimes, how we're reducing vulnerabilities to disease and to mortality in conflict. We will have to save some of those discussions for the mingling afterwards. I would like to thank you all for coming and for contributing. I hope that you will stay on for the reception afterwards. There will be, I can promise you, some very delicate finger food and refreshments, a little bit of an additional program that I hope we will stay for. But before, so we will be leaving out to the left into the main hall of the Red Cross. Before then, I would like to thank our speakers, Debbie, Guha Sapir, and
Thank you.
Morten Øgåsvold.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
And we do have Debbie. Another small token of appreciation. Katrine is here. This is not your average carry-on luggage, but it's the PRIO print,
Thank you, Thomas.
which is made by Trond Nordahl. You have to turn it around, Katrine, so everyone can see it, which we only give to a very select few. This is a very valuable PRIO gift that we hope that you will cherish, Debbie. Thank you so much again for a fantastic presentation and very engaging discussion. I look forward to continue being in touch and working with you in the years to come. And again, I hope that you will join us for the reception. Thank you.
Thank you.